Okay, thank you. This is Simple Politics with Kim Wehle, and I was just introducing you, Olivier Knox, who's a anchor for Washington Post. Tell us a little bit about the Daily 202.
The
First of all,
Daily
thank you for
02
coming too.
Oh, it's my pleasure. My pleasure, Kim. So the Daily 202 is a lunchtime newsletter. So it's not the typical, here's what happened overnight while you were sleeping kind of briefing on politics and policy. But basically every day you'll get a piece of analysis at the top of the column. That's the core part of my job. Some recommended lunchtime reads, both from the Washington Post and from elsewhere. I try to pull in good journalism from regional outlets as well, from specialized outlets. And then sort of a what's happening now. So on your lunch break, if you want to figure out what's happening in DC, what's happening in politics and policy more broadly, then come on by the Daily 202.
Well, if you're just joining again, this is Simple Politics with Kim Wehle, and we're on with the Washington Post's Olivier Knox. We met, I think, on air for Sirius XM. We were talking, I don't even know what. You've been in this business since the impeachment of Bill Clinton, right?
Right.
So what's your, having been in politics and analysis and news journalism for so many years, how would you describe the moment we're in?
Well, I mean, this is sort of a cop-out, but this is obviously a moment of transition. One of the interesting tensions in the Biden presidency already is actually, it's in his campaign slogan, "Build Back Better," right? Part of what he's doing is build back, so it's both a rollback of Trump policies that Democrats don't like, and then there's the better part, right? And one of the challenges right so far, I think, and I'm not sure the White House would agree, is that they're using executive action mostly for the build back, but when it comes to the better, they're going to need to go to Congress, and that's where things are going to get very complicated. I do want to say, I mean, it is understandable that people taking stock of American politics in 2021 would be alarmed by things like the rise of QAnon and other conspiracy theories. I will tell you, back in 1998, so the year of Bill Clinton's impeachment and subsequent trial and acquittal, it was not that hard to find lawmakers in the hallways of congressional office buildings happy to talk to you about how black helicopters from the UN were surveilling them. So we've always had some amount of that kind of, the dark undercurrents of politics have always been there. I'm not minimizing how scary it is today, because the internet has made it possible for these communities to come together and to decide to act, as we saw on January 6th. But these undercurrents have always been there.
Well, and of course, the framers of the Constitution understood that there's a problem with bad information spreading through wave of populism, and then people voting against their interests, and they couldn't have anticipated the internet and Twitter, and that's why we have a representative government. But is it with people like Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, have we crossed some kind of Rubicon where maybe it was a bit underneath the surface, but now the understanding for politicians is, listen, feeding the lies is good for my future. It's good for my power, hold on power.
It's undeniable that at least in the Marjorie Taylor Greene phenomenon, that it is, if not the centerpiece of her appeal to a lot of people, it is certainly one of the most important factors in the way that she appeals to a lot of voters. And I don't know that, again, I've covered politics for a very long time. I've heard a lot of crazy stuff. In that same era, in that same Clinton era, it was not hard to find senior Republicans arguing that Bill Clinton had launched missile strikes on Afghanistan and Sudan as part of a wag the dog strategy. Now, that obviously dates me, because wag the dog, just for the people who have not seen the movie, is basically about an American president who puts on a fake war in order to distract from his domestic problems, just to make that very clear. The Cruz and Hawley are a little bit different. They're trying to tap in to the populist instincts that fueled Donald Trump's rise without embracing the QAnon stuff, not openly. But you are seeing at the state level, you're seeing a number of state Republican parties that are actually embracing the QAnon stuff. They are saying, we are the storm. They are saying, where we go one, we go all. This is on the official Twitter accounts of the actual state Republican Party. So in that sense, yes, we have crossed a Rubicon. You would not have seen this kind of embrace of these theories by what amounts now to the establishment.
Yeah. So what do you make of this rift in the Republican Party? I mean, Steve Schmidt has said, listen, this kind of more off the wall branch, sort of the very right wing conspiracy theory branch, is going to take over the more traditionalists, the Liz Cheney's, et cetera. But maybe that'll be good for Democrats because moderates will come to the Democratic side. Do you have any sense of what's happening with the Republican Party and our two-party system in this moment of transition?
Well, rift is an interesting choice of words, given that an overwhelming majority of House Republicans voted to overthrow the results of the election. So to the degree that there's a rift, what we have is sort of the Steve Schmidt is part of a splinter. I mean, I don't think he calls himself a Republican anymore. Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger today launched this, what he's calling a movement to sort of push back inside the Republican Party against the darker undercurrents, against the conspiracy theories. It's just hard to imagine, having watched the events of the last 4 years, that the Kinzingers of the world are not actually in a tiny minority in the Republican Party.
So does this worry you? Maybe, as a constitutional scholar, just put my cards on the table. I worry about the longevity of democracy itself in America. I was mentioning my concerns for 4 years, starting really with the Mueller probe and no pushback, no accountability. It's like, if there's no ticket for speeding, people will speed. And when I lay it out, listeners get worried and they say, well, what do we do about it? Do you agree, or do you think this is just going to settle itself out and that democracy in America is just going to ride this little wave and then we'll peter off?
No, I mean, the United States as a multiracial, lowercase d democratic country is relatively recent. It wasn't, the 60s are not that far away. And so on the one hand, while I want to be optimistic and say, look, we've got all these institutions, they largely held the line. I do worry about the fact that we have some amnesia about how recent this experiment really is. We tend to go back to the founders, but I don't think that's right. I think we have to go back to when we actually became a multiracial, functioning, lowercase L liberal democracy. So I do have some concerns. I think that the idea that you have a peaceful handover of power, that you acknowledge that you disagree with your political opponents, but they're not illegitimate. One of the things that concerns me is the rise of beliefs that your opponents aren't just wrong, they're illegitimate. So you see in a number of states, it's happening mostly in states with Republican legislatures, but you'll see a Democrat win the governorship and the state legislature will set about stripping the governor, the role of governor, of certain powers that they've enjoyed for decades. And that's really a question of legitimacy. And that does concern me. That is worrisome, because it, in theory, we all want prosperity. We just have different roads to get there. We all want security. We have different roads to get there. And so I do worry about attacks on political adversaries' actual legitimacy, not merely their ideas or policy platforms.
Right. And there's a great book called How Democracies Die. I think two Harvard professors who make that argument, historically looking at functioning democracies, what are the pillars that fall? And one of them is, as you indicate, this notion that I don't just disagree with policy. Anyone who criticizes me is wrong. I want to get back to your just for our viewers, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you indicate that really we weren't a functioning democracy until the 60s. Some people have said part of that is because of the Voting Rights Act actually bringing African Americans into the voting tent in a meaningful way, because even after the post-Civil War amendments, the 13th Amendment, bans enslavement of men, et cetera, women. It wasn't until legislation under Lyndon B. Johnson that we actually had that work. And then the Supreme Court gutted it in 2013 in the Shelby County case. And so that's kind of where we are. We're still having this fight over whether people of color are meaningful players in our democracy. Is that what you mean, or is there something else in the 60s?
No, that is what I mean chiefly. Now there is a span of time after the Civil War and Reconstruction and the rest when we did have even in southern states high rates of black voting, and then there was a massive pushback for decades. But so yes, what I'm talking about is enfranchising, guaranteeing the right to vote to minorities who previously had not had that right to vote. Now, I suppose you could also bring in things like the free speech movement, which transformed the way we understand public discourse in America. But yes, mostly what I mean is the United States as a multiracial republic, multiracial democracy, pick your term, is a relatively new phenomenon.
Yeah, so yesterday, I was driving around the Eastern Shore with a friend and sort of visiting the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad, sort of some of the sites in her museum and things like that. And, it occurred to me that, the 74 million votes for Donald Trump, how much of that is really tied to that sordid, ugly past? Because we've had 420 plus thousand Americans dead from COVID. Like, what do you think am I overstating to say racism is really a big reason, that even if we're not articulating it, or what do you think is the appeal, given really the shambles that our economy, our healthcare, sort of the death toll in America, our foreign policy? I mean, we could go on and on just in terms of neutral assessment of how is a big organization functioning or not. And America was not functioning under Donald Trump towards the end in an efficient, meaningful, thoughtful way.
So I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but we had a large number of Obama, Trump voters. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the most important fuels for the rise of Donald Trump was a widespread and actually quite understandable belief that the elites were wrong and the system was rigged. So, the national security elites gave us Iraq and Afghanistan. The financial elites gave us the crash of 2007, 2008. The cultural elites aren't listening to me. I don't see myself represented in the culture. And so the idea, but the national security elites kept their jobs for the most part. They kept their stature for the most part. John Yoo has a fellowship at a West Coast university of quite significant prestige. Wall Street recovered just fine from 07 and 08. We had a wave of foreclosure fraud across the country that the elites didn't really respond to all that quickly. The Chain of Title, I believe, is the David Dayen book that people should read if they want to learn more about that. And so a lot of this was a reimagining of politics, not as a Democrats versus Republicans, but as an inside versus outside. And the outside rebelled and said, "You elites have screwed us long enough. This system's not working. We're going to lob a grenade into it in the form of Donald Trump. He's going to do the things that he is the outside, and we're going to give him the power on the inside to make changes to the system." So I think that's probably a bigger phenomenon than reducing it just simply to racism.
So and again, for listeners, John Yoo was someone in the elite core of the Department of Justice who is almost a mini Supreme Court, gives advice to the president on the scope of the Constitution, who wrote these now infamous so-called torture memos that defined torture as something short up to the point of organ failure, which means, green light for torture, and has been embraced by the Academy after that. That's how I remember John Yoo, and I've debated him a number of times. Very, very smart guy. But that concept of the president has a lot of power, I think, has just grown even more legs since the Bush years. So
yeah, I agree. I think it definitely has. Yeah, I mean, the way I simplify John Yoo is to say he reimagined the longstanding American consensus about what constituted torture and did not constitute torture, and he led the country. Not the country, that's not fair. He led the Bush administration to a place where they embraced behaviors that fit international definitions of torture that the United States had believed in for decades.
So I want to go back to your comment. I actually listened to, a while ago on the Bulwark podcast, Charlie Sykes talking to Chris Matthews, who was obviously, on MSNBC hardball for many, many years. And he made a similar point. He said, listen, you know, the 74 million voters, whatever, there wasn't the number then because this was prior to the election. They don't want to be spoken down to anymore. They don't want to be marginalized that way. They want to be heard and listened to in a way that, for whatever reason, Donald Trump feels like that they're seen and heard. And I think we all have that human need. But what happened after 4 years that why didn't that get dislodged when, okay, the anti-establishment, the anti-elite isn't doing much better? And I want to go back to COVID. I mean, what are your thoughts on why after all of this, you know, suffering and death, there still are anti-masks? And I read that, you know, one of the huge vaccine sites in California and Los Angeles was closed because of anti-vaccine protesters. This idea of my individual rights, my constitutional rights mean that I have no role in serving the broader public health, which is just antithetical to any reading of the Constitution. We have to balance these things all. So why are they still so coalesced around this?
Well, so on the COVID response, that's a very good question. I have this sort of an informal focus group of Trump voters, and they reach out to me via direct messages on Twitter or on Instagram. And for the first 5 months or so of the pandemic, they were convinced that this was a coastal phenomenon. They were listening to the president tell them that it would vanish soon. They heard the president elevate certain treatments as nothing short of miracle cures. And there was again, this is anecdote. 10 people direct messaging Olivier Knox is not a national survey. It is not scientific in the least. But there was a palpable shift, I think, in July or August, when they started to ask me, when are we getting this vaccine? When are we getting relief checks? When are we getting? And it was interesting because I follow a lot of them on Twitter. And the public rhetoric coming from them was this heavily politicized attack on mask wearing, for example. Mm-hmm. And the private messages I was getting were much more anxious and much more eager for actual information. One thing I will tell you that did not help at all was the way too many instances of decision makers, of leaders who go before the cameras on Friday afternoon and say, you need to be socially distanced. You need to wear a mask. You can't go to church. You can't go to a family reunion. Also, I'm sneaking out later today to have a really fancy dinner with a whole bunch of my friends. That messaging, that was so toxic that I think it undermined a lot of the messages that were coming from the public health community. So that was a problem. That kind of hypocrisy was a problem. The other problem is, you know, we're not that great. The news media is not that great about public health messaging and about messaging about science. So this was a totally new virus. It was unknown. And so we had this evolution of the understanding. You know, it was like, well, we're not sure that there's person-to-person contamination. We're not, okay, don't wear masks. You don't need to wear a mask.
I remember that.
Oh, wait, no, actually, you should all wear masks, right? And we're not great about explaining that as the understanding of something in science changes, so too do the recommendations. The other interesting thing about this, again, this is not a scientific survey at all. The other interesting thing, and I thought about this in real time in 2015 and 2016, was the ways in which Donald Trump broke with a lot of Republican, what previously had been core Republican beliefs. I'm not going to touch your Social Security, your Medicare, or your Medicaid, right? A cycle earlier, the vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party was someone whose entire career was based on a push for cuts to entitlement, right? Paul Ryan. Right. So these orthodoxies that he challenged, and I hear it from I call them my Trump voters. I hear them from the Trump voters who interact with me too, that they feel like he understands their daily economic travails better than other elites, which is an interesting position to take. But so, you know, they would point to that and say, look, he's not going to get us in any more wars. He's not going to cut our Social Security. He's, you know, I can begin to tell you the number of times they would message me and say, finally, the forgotten man is remembered. Now, a lot of these people were doing just fine economically. I'm talking about, take home income upwards of $100,000. But they had this, the anti-elites, that movement, that feeling, that as a driving force that has lost none of its potency. And you see it, you still see it today. The idea that, as I said before, the national security and economic elites and the cultural elites have all failed those 74 million voters in some way.
So where are they going to go now without Donald Trump in, national politics? And is there a way the Democrats can grab them back? I mean, as the sort of my grandparents' 7th grade educations, they were Democrats in upstate New York, Buffalo. And how do you think the Biden administration is doing? How is Joe Biden doing? I mean, he's the Scranton everyday guy that goes to church and speaks plain talk. Is that just lost on the Democrats? Is there any way that your voters or your Trump contacts are going to listen to that side of things?
A majority of my Trump contacts tell me that they're never voting again because they think this election was rigged. And that's a problem for the Republican Party, by the way. Yes, of course, a chunk of them can be brought back into the fold. So back in 2009, Kim, I was covering Congress. And in February, I want to say, I was talking to one of the savvier Republican players in the United States Senate. And we were talking about the push for the stimulus. And we were talking about Barack Obama's other domestic agenda items. And this person, and I said, well, so, do you feel any pressure to support some of these things? They're really popular. And he said, no, our strategy going forward is pretty simple. We're going to make it clear to the American public that Barack Obama can't govern. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we're going to say no to everything. And it's going to look like Barack Obama can't govern. He can't win over Republicans. He can barely unite Democrats. And our message is going to be, he can't deliver. And you see that playing out right now in the Biden administration. The pressure on the president to set aside his talk about doing things in a bipartisan fashion and instead push ahead with a lot of, they're Democratic priorities, but they're also pretty popular priorities in terms of another wave of economic rescue, beefing up the vaccine delivery system and things like that. There's a lot of pressure. And inside the Democratic Party, you can hear a lot of people say, no, we went through this in 2009. We modified the stimulus. We kept the stimulus under $1 trillion in order to win over votes. They never came over. We adopted what we thought was a Republican healthcare plan, the Mitt Romney plan from Massachusetts. We couldn't get any support there. We talked to them about overhauling Wall Street. We couldn't get their support there. Why are we doing this again? This is obviously an overused cliche, but this is Lucy holding the football and inviting Charlie Brown to come kick it. And so there's a lot of pressure on President Biden now to say, okay, and you hear it in his rhetoric when he says, I want to work with Republicans, but I'm going to be uncompromising on the speed with which this passes. There's a lot of pressure to say we're not going to fall for this again, and we need to get things done. And the idea, I told that story about 2009 about he can't govern, because it's actually a really powerful political message. And I think there's a lot of thought inside the Biden White House right now that runs along the lines of, we have to deliver. 2022 is not that far away. We can either get bogged down in trying to win over what could very well be illusory Republican votes. We get bogged down in that, or we can start pushing this stuff through and then run on a record of achievement in 2022. So I think that's a really important way to understand what's happening right now inside the Beltway. And
so there's been some pushback in New York Times, other places, about this wave of executive orders, just from a legal standpoint. They go all the way back to George Washington. FDR used many, many executive orders. But some are saying, as you said at the top of the show, listen, this should be done by Congress. But part of what happened with Congress is the Mitch McConnell blocking everything that came, even through bipartisan ways, in the House of Representatives. And having thought about this for a long time, I do think more stuff should happen through Congress. It shouldn't go to the United States Supreme Court, and it shouldn't happen in the White House or buried in executive branch agencies that are not accountable to the people. But if people decide our elected officials decide that this is the way forward to retain power in the Republican Party is obstruct, obstruct, obstruct. This is where we are. And honestly, Olivier, in terms of next steps, how do you fix it? I don't know what the answer is. I try to encourage people, first of all, to vote. That's very sad to hear, but people aren't going to vote because that's so crucial, but also to vote for people that are willing to compromise and people that have actual integrity. That's how we choose who's in our lives. I mean, do you have thoughts
Right.
on that? You've
So
got a son and I've got 4 daughters. Like they're worried. What do we do, Mom? What do we do?
right. So I may get into trouble with the higher ups of the Washington Post for this because I'm expressing an opinion on a matter of policy. What's the incentive if you're the average House member? What's your incentive for compromising? You don't have one, right? And one of the reasons that you don't have one is that the tool, the grease that made the compromise machine go is gone. Earmarks are gone, right? So earmarks, basically lawmakers would put funding for special projects back in their district or for industries that they were friendly with into legislation.
They're called pork sometimes. Yeah.
Pork, right. But what earmarks did was you could go home and say, yes, I voted. I don't like the president. I voted for this thing he really wanted, but get a load of this. The bridge over the river is about to get completely overhauled. And you told me for years how much you hated the potholes and the fact that there were lanes closed. Well, now it's going to get fixed. And that kind of ability to deliver material goods for your district was a way that you could say, okay, I support this legislation like 49% maybe of my being, but I'm getting stuff for my district. So I'm gonna go ahead and vote for this. And getting rid of earmarks was supposed to reduce sort of basic corruption in the American system, and it was supposed to be a way to reduce spending, and it has done neither. And so there is a small and very quiet constituency on the Hill that says, what if we brought that back? Mm-hmm. What if, because it actually has not reduced spending in any way, shape, or form. There still are plenty of special projects. They're just not, it's harder for members of Congress to go home and say, I did this thing for you. And so I think that's one interesting question, is whether we want to try to restore some of the incentives for compromise. The fact that we've had this great political sorting, which means that you are more concerned about an intra-party challenge, right? You're more worried, if you're a Republican, you're more worried about something running at you in the primary from the right than you are worried about the general election. That has had a huge impact. The fact that you no longer can bring home the pork really as well as you used to be able to, that has had an impact. So in terms of fixing it, I look at these disincentives to compromise and I think to myself, well, how did this used to work? And I don't want to overstate it. I mean, LBJ, we talk about LBJ as this giant of legislating. The minute he loses his majorities, that grinds to a halt. So I don't want to imagine this golden age of legislating and compromise when, if you go back and look at the actual record, it was pretty darn partisan. But so that's sort of,
but there are ways of negotiating. Any negotiation, you have to figure out where's the low-hanging fruit, what can you give, where's the give and take, and there isn't that there isn't the incentive. Of course, they're also, constantly campaigning, and the work week is changed and shortened, and they're using reconciliation and appropriations to ram through things, and they're holding up Congress has decided to use basic budget to sort of force down their agenda. All these things, it's like the food fight is just out of control in the United States Congress. We only have a couple of minutes left, but I do want to ask you, because we were talking in advance about this, and I know you have many, obviously, you grew up partially in France, you're a Francophile as I am, and one of the things I like to do on the show is define terminology. And we heard in the last campaign, a lot of people who support Donald Trump, voters in Florida, other places, that said, we don't want socialism. And it comes out of Donald Trump's mouth. It comes out of Marjorie Taylor Greene's mouth, that socialism is the boogeyman. Socialism is going to ruin everyone's life in America. And there's a big socialist tradition and a strong party in France. I'm wondering, could you weigh in on that? What is socialism, and is it something Americans are understanding properly as a real concern?
So no, they're not really understanding it properly as a real concern. I would say a couple things. One is that, in the textbook, socialism is government control over the means of production, right? So it's the idea that the government sets the price, the cost, the quota for production, the rest of it. It's supposed to be a top-down, government control of the economy. So French socialism is a little curious because it was a French socialist president who privatized the banks, but it is certainly the French socialists would argue it's a way of softening capitalism's harder edges. So the engine of the economy is still capitalism, but the government is making more decisions about how to spread the gains from capitalism. So the French have, a more generous minimum wage, more generous health, more generous vacation. They are more heavily regulated, of course. The thing about American voters worried about socialism is I separate them into two populations. One is the people who remember the Cold War, and the other are the people who, in places like Florida, look to places like Cuba and Venezuela and say, we don't want that here. Now, they also then in Florida go ahead and vote for a $15 minimum wage, which is government setting the price and value of labor. In the Trump era, you saw the tariffs imposed willy-nilly on allies and adversaries alike, coupled with transfer payments, huge transfer payments to farmers who were hurt by the trade war. So it was something like $28 billion in the last year of the Trump administration paid out to farmers. You saw the president attacking individual companies, Harley Davidson and others. Those kinds of steps, if they'd been undertaken by a Democratic president, would have drawn accusations of socialism.
So there's a intellectual dishonesty or hypocrisy going around it, but in its more moderate form, the idea is to sort of the government manages what we call externalities in the economics world. That idea that just smooth stuff out so there isn't this massive have and have not, and Barack Obama talked about, that income gap, the poverty gap that we're seeing, that some of those principles could actually help lower income Americans.
But we should be very clear that the kind of socialism that we're talking about in places like Norway and France is absolutely not the kind of socialism we're talking about in Cuba and Venezuela, where it is extremely repressive, one party, one person rule, with absolutely savage political and economic outcomes. Both. I don't want to soft pedal that at all. But the way I think of it, Kim, is when you look at the polling for Congress, Congress is less popular than syphilis. But if you ask individual Americans how they feel about their Congress critter, they're usually pretty positive. Same with public education. The schools are all terrible. What about your school? Oh no, we're doing okay. There's this recurring message that you see across politics of, the system isn't working, but my corner of it's doing okay. In terms of this, I expect that we will hear more of the conversation about. In fact, I'm really eager to see the minimum wage conversation in Congress because of those Florida results. Because Florida was far redder than the polls had suggested it would be, and yet they took this step of approving a $15 minimum wage. I'm very curious about that. Again, I think it's important to think of this of American politics today as outside versus inside more than left versus right. You saw some deep red states in the last 4 years take steps towards legalizing marijuana, for example. 20 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. And so I think we're seeing the deck reshuffled in some very interesting, and I think at least for me, I'm not sure what direction I don't know what the destination is exactly. And I don't know what the outcome of these policy and political fights is, but I think we're seeing the deck shuffled in some pretty interesting ways.
So it's certainly not that now Joe Biden's in office that things are going to quiet down and there's nothing for people like you and me to talk about, right?
No, we've all been joking about how this is going to be boring. It's not, though. Just because the first thing you do when you get up in the morning is not check Twitter to see who or what Donald Trump has attacked overnight. There are some really important national decisions to be made. There are some really important policy fights that are going on. Just the question of how do we improve the COVID vaccination campaign, right? How do we get to if not normal, at least normal adjacent. That's a big conversation. And then there are conversations to be had. I mean, one of the interesting things about Biden's position on trade is he's now on the record as saying he's not going to lift those tariffs on China, and he said that there are things he will not do. He will not engage. He will not get involved in it. He will not negotiate a trade deal until he has secured bipartisan agreement on a big infrastructure package. We're going to see the fact that we're going back to a more traditional policymaking process doesn't mean that it's boring.
Right.
We're having a lot of really, really important conversations. We're just, maybe screaming a tiny bit less.
Well, and I know I said that we're going to wrap up, but I was wondering if you could just touch on the GameStop story and the fact, I mean, to your point, we have AOC and Ted Cruz kind of both getting behind the regular investor in that regard. And so for people that are sort of, you see in the headlines, GameStop, what is that about, and how does that bear on our conversation right now about this kind of more populist, we the people, but not in the traditional historical sense through elitist politicians?
Right. So on the surface, and I bet we're going to discover there's a lot more to this story than what we've learned to date. But on the surface, it looks like small investors banding together to drive up the share price, the share value of GameStop, and by the way, a couple of other companies that Wall Street was betting against. If you think of
Blockbuster, yep.
Blockbuster, AMC, movie theaters, kind of throwback, by the way,
Right.
I mean, I feel like we should say what Blockbuster is at this point.
Yeah, for the video store.
You used to go to the store and rent videotapes, which you would play on a machine called a VC. I mean, I feel that old now. But so the traditional elitist markets were betting on them failing. That's right.
Okay.
So if you think of every stock purchase as a bet on how that stock is going to do. Suppose you and I we disagree on the future value of shares in Knox Enterprises, okay? And you think that Knox Enterprises is a loser, and I think Knox Enterprises is a winner. There are transactions that are a little bit more complicated than just buying or selling the stock. You can purchase the right to sell or buy a stock at today's price in a month, right? So if you believe that Knox Enterprises is a loser, and I think Knox Enterprises is a winner, I want the right to buy Knox Enterprises at today's price in a month, because I figure that in a month it'll be, say it's trading at $10 today, I'm betting it's going to be trading at 30 in a month. So I would be making a lot of money, and conversely, you'd be losing a lot of money. Well, what happened here is you had these big Wall Street institutions that said GameStop's a loser, AMC's a loser, Blockbuster. Why are we even talking about Blockbuster in 2021? So they bet against them. They basically they paid for the privilege of selling the GameStop stock at today's price in the future. Well, all these little investors drove up GameStop's share price. At one point, I think it was more highly valued than Apple, I think, which was pretty wild, right? So,
and they did it through an app, right? Robinhood.
That's one way. That is one way. Think back to things like E-Trade and Robinhood. There are all these apps now that take a lot of the friction out of investing. It's much easier. You and I are, well, maybe not you. I'm old enough to remember when you had to go through a broker.
Merrill Lynch. Yeah.
Right. So no, now you can go through your phone. Like everything else, you can reserve, you can order your takeout dinner and invest, $300 in Apple if you want. So they did this heavily through the app. But what happens is, okay, so I've now basically contracted to sell GameStop at $19 a share. The small investors have driven the value to $500 a share. I'm screwed, right? Because I'm going to be selling something that's worth $500 for 19. So I think that this is another pretty good example of what I was describing earlier as the inside-outside dynamic, where you have a revolt of, again, as far as we know, because I'm a little bit concerned that we're going to discover that this was more astroturf than grassroots, but you have the little investors who are basically taking very simple steps, and the result is chaos for the richest of the rich on Wall Street. And as I said, sort of near the top, um, Americans dislike their elites. That includes the news media, by the way. But they really loathe Wall Street and the banks. You know, we're in a place in politics now where both parties are running. You'll hear, criticisms of Wall Street from both parties.
Right. As I mentioned, Ted Cruz and AOC around this issue. And as you mentioned, we're in a transition. As dark as things can seem, something like this could actually move the markets into an environment potentially that is more, equal or fairer for the regular person. We just don't know. But the tides are the plates in the earth are shifting in that regard. Anyway, well, thank you, Olivier. I know you are very, very busy with your new job, and it's really been a privilege to have you on Simple Politics, and I learned a lot, and I'm sure all of our viewers did as well. So thank you for taking the time this morning.
My pleasure, Kim. Thanks very much for having me.
Okay, bye, everybody. Thanks again.